We are.
Unbuckle, put your tray down.
Welcome, everybody. We're going to give everybody probably 30 more seconds to jump in the room, and then we'll start with introductions. But we have a really great conversation slated for today. I'm interested to see kind of where this one goes. As a reminder, if you've not been to a Rockerbox webinar before, we like to keep these conversational. If you have any questions or anything that you want to add to the conversation, you can do that in the chat. It should be on the left-hand side of your screen. You can post whatever you want there. The entire audience will be able to see it, but we'll take those questions as they come. Or if you have comments or if you agree or disagree, let us know. We want to keep this pretty fluid in the way that we engage. So with that being said, I think we can go ahead and jump in. I'm going to let the panel introduce themselves. So Ron, if you want to jump in and introduce yourself first.
Sure. Just hearing some echo. Is anybody else hearing that, or is it just me? Just pretty good. Okay, cool. I'll talk through an echo. So I'm Jacobson, co-founder of Rockerbox. Super excited to be here. We'll talk about this a lot, but Rockerbox is trying to build the world's best measurement platform. We offer solutions across multi-touch attribution, media mix modeling, incrementality testing, and all built on top of a consistent marketing data foundation. Super excited to be here talking with Jim and Matt. Thanks for joining, everybody.
Cool. Awesome. I'm Matt Bahr. I'm the founder and CEO of Fairing. We power attribution surveys for a few thousand brands. Simplest definition of an attribution survey is a question that's asked to a consumer to help understand kind of top of funnel measurement, usually in the way of like, how did you hear about us, or what led you to our site? And excited to dive in with these two.
And I'm Jim Gianoglio, founder of Cauzle Analytics, where we specialize in helping brands get the most out of their marketing mix modeling. Over the past 15 plus years in marketing analytics, I've had the privilege of working with clients in a wide range of industries, from D2C, CPG, QSR, and probably a few other acronyms I'm leaving out, really just to help those companies improve their marketing performance.
Awesome. I was going to make a joke if Ron wasn't back yet, that we were talking about being controversial at the beginning, and he thought he'd just start us off by just leaving.
It turns out I had another tab where I was listening to the presentation, the webinar. So.
Oh, there's your echo.
That'll happen.
Awesome. Okay. Well, without further ado, I think we can jump in. It'd be really great to set some opening context for the conversation. So I'd love it if each of you can kind of share your perspective on how marketing measurement in the landscape has evolved over the last few years. Where do we stand today in terms of measurement options for marketers? And I think it'd be great if Matt, you could kick us off.
Yeah, cool. So I think we'd all agree a lot of this kind of kicked off with Apple a few years ago with app transparency tracking. And at least from what we're seeing, the approach to measurement prior to that was very much bottoms up. We had MMM, we had a few of these other methodologies prior to that, but from a popularity standpoint and just basic understanding of measurement, this bottoms up approach was definitely what was 90% of the toolkit. And from at least what we see, ATT coupled with kind of GDPR have really just pushed this model on its head, where brands are now starting to think from a top-down approach. So looking at, hey, how do we measure if we don't have deterministic one-on-one data? Can we kind of aggregate this and look at regressions and understand these things? So I think that's I was thinking about this question before, and like to me, that was like really the turning point of methodology, at least with the proliferation. I'm sure Ron has a deeper insight into the exact dates and when this started to push. But that's how we viewed. And the last thing to mention, without like, I can't answer this question without getting a plug for how did you hear about us survey data, but how did you hear about us data previously was, I feel like it was just something maybe added to the toolkit, and now it's starting to be kind of a necessary requirement for that toolkit, especially as you start to diversify channels into into podcasts and TV and these kind of harder non-click based channels. We're now this nice to have. We look at our how did you hear about us data periodically to, hey, how do we get this data into Rockerbox, like into all my other systems to help paint the bigger picture. But yeah, that's kind of the turning point, at least how we've seen things change.
Yeah, I was going to agree with everything that you said, but then we said we're not allowed to agree. But I guess on this one, there's probably going to be a lot of agreement. I think to build on what you said, Matt, like the past 20 years with the rise of digital, we've been obsessed with digital and trackability and being able to track all the touch points at the user level, which fed into attribution technologies that relied on all that data collection. And I think we're kind of shifting from this era of the past 20 years into sort of a new era where fueled by privacy concerns and all the technology changes, Apple, ATT and ITP and all the changes that they've made over the past few years, that has really kind of eroded that data foundation to the point where, you can, all you have to do is log into Facebook ads and see that it says some campaign has an ROI of 8.3, and you're like, there's no way in hell that that's right. Or maybe it's undercrediting and it says it has an ROI of 0.2, and it's like, that can't be right. And so like marketers are realizing that the emperor has no clothes, or at least it's maybe he's down to his underwear, I'm not sure, but we're starting to realize that we need more beyond just the platform attribution and the multi-touch attribution tools. We need to see it from multiple angles, multiple perspectives, and that's where MMM and testing come into play.
So I actually will disagree. So I'll be a little bit different here. I think the main change in my mind is that I don't fully disagree, obviously, but like I think a slightly different perspective is actually, I think you have V1 of attribution companies that are all kind of acquired. You have your Visual IQ, your Convertro, Odometry, Clear Selling. I think like all that V1 of attribution, again, was very much trying to do MTA. I think the problem was they were all trying to do it based off third-party cookies. They had this idea that, hey, I could take a third-party cookie and use that to track everything, which is a stupid proposition to begin with because there's no third-party cookies on TV or in direct mail or on radio. There are just so many channels where from the beginning, even the notion of using a third-party cookie had no relation with the channel, that it was almost like the original sin of, I think, MTA V1, this notion that you could use cookies as this connecting layer. So I would actually argue the bigger change I've seen has been recognizing that's not viable. And that if you do want to construct a path to conversion, you need to capture first-party data. You need to capture email addresses, you need to capture phone numbers, physical mailing addresses, and you construct partnerships based off that actually do enable you to connect the dots between different platforms. Which ironically, given that it was really, Matt, I think called privacy changes, or Jim as well, in a weird way, we've gone to a world where we actually have higher fidelity ability to put together a path to conversion, even though we were trying to deal with privacy changes that were trying to limit data collection. Again, not to make this about Rockerbox, but like we have the ability to connect deterministic data of a conversion with like Reddit or Pinterest or Snapchat because we have first-party data and we can strike a partnership. So I think that was a huge change. It was evolving beyond third-party cookies to using first-party data to make a more robust data foundation for a path to conversion. I'd say in the past couple of years, where I'm seeing a changing is the proliferation, frankly, of media mix modeling being faster, more available, more affordable, and more effective than it used to be. And also testing starting to become a much more available channel. The way that we see customers really leveraging it very effectively, and we'll talk about this later, is using that to sort of improve or calibrate or refine that day-to-day data set that they're using to make optimization. So that's at least what we're seeing. But I think that's been the biggest change I felt personally, and I've seen a lot of customers come into Rockerbox for.
Yeah, I think that's a really great lead into the next question, but we do have a question from Luke in the audience. And Luke, we are going to kind of touch on this in later questions, but I think we'll give the panel an opportunity to answer right now, and they can kind of tap back to it if they want to. But Luke asked, could the panel share practical examples of how to help a company wean off of attribution, i.e. businesses have wrapped themselves around attribution just because we on this call know that there is more triangulation needed. How do we convince others? And Ron, I feel like you are particularly well suited to answer this from your point of view, because maybe it's a little bit different than what Luke's point of view might be.
I think what you need to do is it's hard to move an organization. So it's like organizations are like these giant, yachts, like I don't know, whatever it is, cruise liner, whatever it is. You can't move them overnight. It's really hard to do. So I think what you need to do is kind of crawl, walk, run it. I think that if you've been reporting on, I'm assuming by attribution, you probably mean like a last click Google Analytics kind of attribution. If I had to guess, my gut would say, run a media mix model, run a test, build a data foundation that goes beyond just Google Analytics data, like take slow steps that can start to show there are different ways to measure different results. The main thing to avoid though is all of a sudden saying, hey, we've been reporting out the CPA of Meta for the past 2 years is 20, and then we completely changed systems overnight, and now it's 90. You could do that, but it's going to cause just chaos in your organization. The chaos of which I don't think is, even if the 90 number is correct, the chaos is not worth it. It's just going to make everyone freak out versus being more thoughtful on how you approach that. Hey, it used to be 20. We ran this test. We now think it's closer to 90. We're going to go from 20 to 40. And we'll run another test in another month, another quarter, and maybe we'll continue to inch our way there. So I think it's definitely a crawl, walk, run approach.
I think as well too, if you were to incorporate survey data, like how did you hear about us data, and then compare it to the last click data, or maybe even use the how did you hear about us data in a prior to an MMM to help inform that baseline, would be a good strategy. And that's I was going to ask Ron about this later. If you were to compare click data, let's say last click data, to how did you hear about us data, it's a very easy matrix to understand. Like you're almost looking at first, last touch. It's not a complex model that maybe you need to spend an hour trying to educate someone on. So that could be a good way to kind of almost like throw a shock factor in of like, this is our last click that we're optimizing towards, but these are the channels where discovery is happening to. Like maybe this opens the door for some testing or a larger kind of MMM implementation after you've kind of had that first foray into like the shock factor of like, okay, the last click, if that's what you're looking at, is not the best way to look at this.
Yeah, I would just throw in there too. One topic that Ron mentioned was change management, right? Like that, and I'm probably going to mention this a few more times throughout the webinar. Is like there's a lot of change management that needs to happen here because we're asking marketers to fundamentally change their processes and the way that they do their day-to-day and week-to-week operations, and that doesn't happen overnight. And people hate change, so you have to kind of work with them, decide, determine a good process that they can start to implement. And as far as the specific question around weaning off of attribution, I would take a different approach. I wouldn't say wean off. I would say layer on. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a yes and.
Yeah. And I think that is a pretty good segue into the next conversation, which is where does attribution, specifically multi-touch attribution, provide the most value today? And whoever wants to lead off can lead off.
I'm curious.
I think that,
okay, go ahead.
I think my take on this, or one take on this is it helps marketers understand what the user journey looks like in that path to purchase. So let's say you were just running incrementality testing on a per channel level or a media mix model. It's like, what is that like? Where does discovery happen? And then what are they doing right before they discover on that journey? And whether it's from a media optimization perspective of like, okay, the MTA is actually informing this, or if it's merely just like, I'm the marketer, arguably my value in this org is this mental model of how acquisition happens at this company, and MTA helps me inform that model to make better decisions throughout my day, is kind of a second layer effect of this. So that was like the easiest thing to pinpoint for me in this question, is like understanding the user journey. It's like, yeah, people Google us after they see a TV ad. And without any concept of multi-touch, you're not going to be able to understand that.
Yeah, that's great. I remember I used to do Google Analytics trainings, and whenever we would get to the multi-channel funnels reports, you'd show people like, look, it took 87 paths or touch points for this person to convert, or this group of people to convert. And it was like, oh yeah, last click probably doesn't quite capture all of that. But I like the idea of like just showing people like the underlying complexity of what we're actually trying to measure here. In terms of where I see multi-touch attribution fitting, I kind of think about it from a different perspective, as aligning it with the stage of the company, right? So if you're an early stage startup or early growth company, like MTA is going to be your best friend. It's still going to do the job. It's going to give you directionally accurate or correct data to help you make decisions. If you're only spending, a certain amount, or only in, you only have 3 or 4 different channels and they're mostly digital, maybe you have Google Ads, Facebook, and I don't know, throw in TikTok or YouTube or CTV. You don't need anything more than multi-touch attribution. That's going to do the job for you. When you start adding on more channels and additional spend, and especially in harder to measure channels like linear TV or radio or out of home, that's where MTA starts to have a little bit more trouble, and where you need to start looking at other ways of measuring those, like MMM and testing.
My 2 cents here is MTA is best for that day-to-day hub of your marketing measurement. It's the most up-to-date data, it's the most granular data, and it's going to be the most consistent data in the sense of what happens for how a conversion is reported out today is going to be how the conversion is reported out tomorrow, a week from now, a month from now. So to me, it's like that sort of hub of your marketing. And we'll talk about this later. I think layering on, to use Jim's term, other types of measure methodologies to sort of refine that or calibrate it is where we find the most success. So Rockerbox, for example, has the ability to measure linear TV through MTA, but there's a fair case to say, you know what, I want to run a test and actually prove out the validity of that linear TV. That's great. Run that test, figure out the incrementality of it, and then apply that as a multiplier on top of your core foundational MTA, which again, every day you'll have access to. It's going to be super granular. And it does also unlock certain analyses that you can't get from anywhere else. Matt talked about the path to conversion. There's time to conversion. There's overlap between channels. Just some sorts of analyses that it's really really well suited for. Wow, we're getting lots of questions.
Well, I was gonna say we have a lot of questions. So and you know what? If we don't get through all of the panel questions, that's fine. I'd rather you all kind of speak to the audience questions anyways. So I actually think that's a good lean in to Asia's question, Ron. They asked what value should be placed on attribution versus MMM versus testing, conversion lift, brand lift. What's your point of view there?
I mean, again, so like we are Rockerbox offers all these. So in a way, for me, it's more not how do we get customers using the most of them, but how do we get them using them where they get the most value out of it. And to me, that's, again, you need your day-to-day data that you use to run your company, your organization. And your day-to-day data just really can't be based off tests that were run a quarter ago or a mean mix model that was run a week ago, a month ago, a quarter ago, half year ago. You know, every vendor has a different cadence. But MMM and testing provide really interesting insights. MMM provides full business context. You can include competitors and seasonality and promo codes. Like there's great insight that it brings that you want to layer on top of your day-to-day data. And similar with incrementality testing. It's a great way to get a really refined sense of the incrementality of a channel of yours at a point in time though. So both of those are analyses that are kind of historical in some capacity. Taking those and using it to make sure your day-to-day data is the most accurate is where we find the most valuable, find the most value. Going to Jim's point, you know, Meta reports out on that 8 ROAS. Great, you ran an incrementality test, you find it's only 50% incremental. Let's downweight that by 50% every single day moving forward. And maybe in another month, quarter, you're going to have to run another test. Great, you can run that. But tests are expensive and they're costly too. So in a way, you want to run, in my mind, the fewest tests possible to get the most data you need. Wow, there's so many questions.
Yeah, I'll just throw in there too. And a lot of times that question is asked of like, which one do I believe? I have these 3 different things and they're all saying 3 different things, 3 different platform methods, and they're giving me different answers. And the thing that I like to use here is something I stole from Ben Dutter at Power Digital. He calls it the BEATS framework. It basically says like, here are the sources of truth, right? Here's what we believe. If we don't have, you know, testing is sort of our source of truth. That's our ground truth. If we can get a good randomized controlled trial or a geolift experiment or a random conversion lift study and platform, that's going to be our highest quality signal to noise. If we don't have that, then we might use MMM. If we don't have that, we might use attribution. If we don't have that, we use our business metrics. You know, it just kind of goes down that line to say like, kind of in terms of what has more signal than noise, it kind of walks that down. If you Google it or look on LinkedIn for BEATS framework, you could probably find it.
Matt, did you have anything else to add there?
Not on that one, no.
Okay. So we have a lot of questions here. If we don't get to all of the questions and you have a question that you'd like follow up on, we can follow up with you offline as well. There's a couple that are really interesting. I am going to go to the next one though. They're curious on the perspective of MTA for B2B versus B2C. I think this is a question that we're getting more and more as we see more B2B brands kind of come in on the Rockerbox side. So I'd be interested to see kind of what your opinions are here.
I think that just to chime in here, so we're expanding into B2B as we speak right now. And I think the biggest learning for us is like SMB to enterprise B2B, if we think about MTA. So if it's SMB and you're getting higher volume, then MTA will work much better than if you're more of long cycle enterprise SaaS or whatever that kind of vertical may be. So that's kind of the big difference that we're seeing. Like if you were to ask somebody how they heard about like Segment, for example, something, or Twilio, something that has a lot of kind of awareness and penetration over the last few years, probably not gonna be super valuable. And maybe measuring those clicks might not be super valuable because what drove that user to purchase might be something that happened prior to. So that's at least how we're seeing the problem. I haven't talked to Ron about this yet, so I'm curious kind of what he's thinking when it comes to MTA and ACV size. It's kind of the big function for us.
I think there are different types of B2B. It's not one size fits all. I think you have a lot of B2B that has more of a D2C playbook going nuts on acronyms there. I think there's a lot of B2B that is much more salesperson driven. It's about events, it's about dinners and things like that. I think the former easily fits into kind of an MTA or even other types of measurement framework. I think the latter, again, more salespeople, events, offline type things, that's just much more difficult to track. There are some companies who focus on that exclusively. It's just not companies like Dream Data. You should take a look at. I think it was Visible back in the day. They're good companies for that. More on the salesperson driven B2B.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on. So David is asking, on MTA use cases, do you see unique use cases for first-party data-based MTA versus channel MTA from, say, Meta? Does a company need both?
How are we defining channel MTA from Meta, I think is my question.
My gut says it's probably platform reported
Platform,
attribution, but that's kind of an interesting point. Like, I mean, I think the fact is that, I guess, David, platform attribution. The problem is the platforms themselves are not, they're Meta's reporting just on itself. If you serve someone an ad and they convert, Meta's saying they drove that conversion. Same with Bing, same with TikTok, same with everybody. And nobody is doing anything like nefarious. Like, that's their job. Their job is to say, did I serve someone an ad and did they convert? None of them are like, Meta's never going to say, well, I served this person an ad, but then they saw an ad on TV tomorrow, so I'm only giving myself half credit for that ad. That's not how they approach it. So I think they're kind of just like different use cases. Now, I think platform attributed numbers are interesting and useful. It definitely is a signal to leverage, but it's not going to help you understand how the channels are interacting with each other. It's not going to give you deduplicated data. You're going to get the classic issue where you add up what every single channel says they drove, and your business is doing 5x better than it really did. So that's what makes it a little bit difficult to leverage as your foundation.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to move to the next question unless anybody else has something else to add. Jeff asked, what are your thoughts on using something like path to conversion from the trade desk versus going full MTA modeling? Is that good enough if you're mostly advertising on the trade desk and search?
Jim or Matt?
It's going to be, I'm not super familiar with their path to conversion. I know they have their own pixel, so yeah, it depends what your goal is, I guess, and how accurate that data is going to be.
Yeah, I would always argue for simplicity, the simplest approach that works. So if you're mostly, advertising on trade desk and search, then it's probably going to be fairly accurate. Asterisk.
Well, I think it's this kind of comes back to like data foundations in my mind. And like if you think about a Google Analytics, right? Imagine you're doing search and the trade desk and you try to use GA. The problem is you're not going to get impression-based data from the trade desk into GA. So like, it's always in my mind, like, do you have the right underlying data foundation on top of which you can do any type of measurement, be it MTA, be it MMM, et cetera, et cetera. So like, if you're just relying on the trade desk's path to conversion data, you're only getting the impressions that the trade desk served. So if you're running on the trade desk and Facebook, I mean, it's kind of no different than that question that I think David asked about platform attribution. It's essentially just using the media served through that platform to try to do construct a path to conversion, which is a bit of a myopic perspective in terms of what's actually on the path to conversion.
And the danger too is that it's attribution, not incrementality, unless maybe they have some other things built in with sort of, Google with their data-driven attribution tries to do Monte Carlo chain Markov chain Monte Carlo simulations to get an actual, what happens if it's out. But my guess is that's probably not the case.
Awesome. We actually have a couple of questions on calibration, which leads us to our next question. So we'll go ahead and just pop forward. So marketing mix modeling or media mix modeling has definitely seen a resurgence as marketers are seeking more comprehensive, Matt touched on privacy, compliant solutions and concerns. Can the three of you speak to the types of brands or scenarios where MMM is the best fit and what makes it a complement to attribution, multi-touch attribution specifically?
Yeah, I can take this. I think brands that have, I think where you start wanting to look at marketing mix modeling is if you have a certain level of ad spend let's just safely call it, let's say 5 million ad spend a year. Some people would disagree. Smart folks will say maybe it's 2 million, maybe it's 10 million. I've done MMMs with as little as a million in spend. That kind of is probably as low as I would want to look at it. But let's say 5 million in ad spend, and you're using more than just 3 or 4 digital channels, right? You have some of those harder to measure channels. You have linear TV, you have billboards, you have terrestrial radio, you might have podcast advertising, influencers. Like you have a really complicated mix, and that's where it starts to come into play. And like Ron mentioned earlier, if you're wanting to understand more of the whole picture, right? How does price changes in your product affect your sales and affect the efficiency of your channels? How does certain promotions throughout the year affect that? How does competitor activity affect that? The weather potentially for certain brands, right? When you want to consider all of that and have a real understanding of the full portfolio of channels, that's where MMM starts to shine. As far as like complementing MTA, and we talked about this, like it's not weaning off of MTA and switching to MMM, it's adding this on top of. Think about it as getting a second opinion from a doctor, right? Like if you go to the doctor and you say, I have a persistent headache, and they say, it's just stress related, just take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning. But that can't be true, because you're a marketing analyst, and what stress could you possibly have in your life? Your life is rainbows and unicorns. So you think, that can't be true. Maybe I'm going to get a second opinion. And so you go to another doctor, and they take a swab of your nose and run a quick test, and it turns out you just have a sinus infection that's causing the headaches, and they prescribe an antibiotic, right? That's what MM is. It's a second opinion on what's going on. And where was I going with that analogy? I guess I could stretch it a little bit further, but I'll stop there. It's just getting a more informed opinion on an area where you think there's probably not, the MTA is not really capturing the full causal nature of what's happening. It's giving you another perspective on that.
I actually,
Yeah, I think.
Oh, go ahead, Matt. Sorry, I was going to say I love the analogy, but Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, as far as the size, like it's almost, at what ad spend does it make sense to spend the money and the time, because the kind of opportunity cost is starting to be too great if your media mix is not optimized. So let's say you are a few channels, million or even 5 million, let's say, and 80% of it's on Meta. There's probably not too much you can learn there until you start to scale into other channels, where an MMM might be like very, very helpful as far as the output of that. So I think to your first part, it's when that channel distribution starts to kind of increase, and understanding the opportunity cost of a misallocated channel mix is starting to get quite large. And then I don't know, I'd be curious about your opinion, Ron, but as far as like third party, like external factors, in the sense of things like election cycles, weather, like things that could affect it. I don't know. I would assume that, like, I would probably recommend then doing that at a much larger scale. Just there's other things to focus on in an MMM, unless maybe you have a product that you think is like highly variable based on those factors. But that is another value of MMM when you think about it. I was talking to a sandal company recently, and their sales during the summer like double when it's over like 95 degrees. And it's just like people are thinking about sandals. So there's definitely, you might not need an MMM to figure that out, to be honest. You could just grab some weather data, but definitely will help you kind of ask questions maybe you weren't thinking about.
Yeah, the example that comes to mind there is we work with a golf company that sponsors a golfer. And during the 4 majors in the year, the sales spike. And like, we didn't think about that or know about that when we built the first model. And we're like, okay, something's really off here. We can't do our prediction versus, our accuracy is pretty bad these 4 days of the year. And it's one of those like duh moments. But like, I think that's an awesome use case for, well, not a use case, but like reason why MM brings value, right? It's trying to build a framework that understands your entire business, and brings that to bear to help, as Jim was saying, get that second perspective on your marketing. And there are things that it can do really well, there are things that it can't do well, and that's fine. But like, it does bring unique perspective that can be really, really valuable. And again, make sure that like whatever you're using on a day-to-day basis, it could be a week or month, a quarter after that golf major happened. You still need something to run every single day, but trying to make sure that data you're using every day is as accurate as possible.
Ron, do you have examples of a company maybe using an MMM who maybe it was a little bit too early and they just didn't get the value out of it, but they wanted to do it for some other reason? Like, is that a common occurrence?
They heard it at a conference. They had to do it.
they heard Jim talk.
I bet you Jim has examples. I mean, it seems up your alley.
I mean, I've had companies come to me and as prospects, and we looked at some of their data, and I said, sorry, I don't think you're ready for this. It just doesn't make sense. You know, you like the point you made, Matt. Like, if you're spending 80% of your budget in Meta, you're not going to learn much from an MMM, right? And if you're spending 50,000, 100,000, 150,000, whatever it is on a MMM, whether it's a vendor or consultant or whatever, you need that to be ROI positive, just as your media is. And if you don't think you can make changes that are going to cause gains of or savings of that much, then don't even go there, right?
Luke had a question kind of on this note. He asked, should you choose an out-of-the-box solution for MMM versus building in-house with something like Robin? Curious on the pros and cons.
Oh, this is a hot topic. I'll find some good articles that talk about this. Recast, if you're not familiar with them, they have some great thoughts on this and some great articles around this. Also, Mass Analytics is another company out in the UK that has a really good article on this. I would say there are a lot of pros and cons for each one. I would say if you're thinking about doing it in-house, first, just make sure that you have the internal resources. And I'm not saying like, oh, we have a data scientist who kind of splits his time between doing work over here for the finance team and doing some marketing stuff over here. Like, that's not going to cut it. It's really a full-time position. And that's assuming you have the data all nice and collected and in order. I've worked with the company for the past, now we're going on 14 months. And a lot of what I do is either build for or build with. A lot of what I try to do is build with, help companies build out the internal capabilities to own and control their own model. Because I think there are a lot of pros to that. You're not dependent on some other third-party vendor, and you kind of control the specifics around your business, because it's very hard to make this a one-size-fits-all product. But yeah, you really need to have some internal expertise that can spend the majority of their time on this. And they need to know not just the data science and statistics, but also the marketing side. And I see a lot of companies that have, we have a team of data scientists. I'm actually talking with a prospect right now from a very well-known company that has a team of data scientists, and they tried using Lightweight MMM, which is Google's unofficial open source framework that is the foundation of Meridian, which is the next version of theirs. And they tried building on Lightweight, but data science and statistics knowledge alone doesn't translate fully into how do we believe marketing works and how do we model that. Like, you really have to have that marketing knowledge too.
One thing I'd add there, I agree with everything Jim said. I'd also add, I've seen many companies use an open source model one time, and I've seen many of those companies never use it a second time. So I think that's a lot of the problem with MMM is it's talked about all the time, getting the data centralized, building a good model, but it's also like, how do you make this a muscle that you're going to do over and over and over again? And that I've seen a lot of companies fail there. They spool up that one data scientist for 20% of their time to get we got our first Robin or our first, I forget Uber's one. Orbit, thank you. And yay, good job. But now what? And in a weird way, I almost think that's where consultants or contractors or third-party vendors, kind of because they have to keep doing it, they force the muscle to be built, right? Like, so I've seen some more success in terms of getting it reused there. You could maybe say, hey, it's worth it to do one time internally to see if there's a there at all. And then maybe you want to really figure out, are you doubling down internally, getting somebody full-time on that? Or are you going to go work with a third-party contractor company, whatever it is, to try to make this a repeated thing that we do as an organization?
Yeah, and the great thing about the great thing, but also the double-edged sword of platforms like Robin, it is very easy to get a model up and running, and within an hour you have some model output and some results. But how do you validate those? Like, that's where, or in Robin's case, for example, it'll give you like, oh, here's 10 models or 10 potential models that might work. They all have really good normalized root mean squared error, and they have good R squareds, but they all say like opposite things. They say very different things. They paint different stories, and it's like, okay, now what am I supposed to do? And so there's a lot of that. Like, it makes it really easy to get a result, but if those results are actually accurate or not, it's hard to tell. So it does require some knowledge of how they work and how to validate them.
Yeah, I would just to add to, I would assume that MMM as a methodology is almost commoditized in the sense of the product is not as relevant as the marketer who is actually using it and understanding the output. So if you have an extremely experienced marketer / data team who has implemented an MMM before, like looking at Robin might not be a horrible idea. If you are a 20 person, 10 million or $20 million GMV company, like with a marketer who's been really good, like is a meta pro as far as buying media there, and they're thinking about implementing Robin, like probably not the best kind of use of time and capital to try to do that in-house. So I think that I know a general like thought that we have is like measurement is kind of this moving chart, and there won't necessarily be a one size fits all, as we're kind of talking about triangulation and all these different methodologies, and kind of experience and skill set like is half of the equation. If you can't fill that other half, then yeah, go talk to a platform that like has that expertise because they're thinking about that problem 24/7.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I know we had a couple other questions, but I'm going to push us forward just because I think we want to talk about testing and we want to talk about how all of these methodologies work together too. So just in favor of time, let's see what we've got next. So testing is considered a crucial component in validating campaign impacts. We've already talked about attribution. We've talked about MMM. How can brands incorporate testing into their measurement stack, and what value does it add alongside the other methodologies?
I think just I'll let these two kind of jump into this, but what Jim alluded to before is like a causal model is going to be the best understanding of if marketing actually attributed to additional revenues or not. So testing is going to be how it's integrated into the stack is important, and I think as far as how it interacts with MTA and MMM, like it's going to be dependent on what that media mix looks like and what channels you can test and how all this fits together. But I do think that back to that MMM question we just spoke about, expertise, like testing arguably is even more difficult to get appropriate test out there. And I think this is one that is definitely thrown around very often as far as like incrementality and kind of doing these. And it's a little bit still obtuse, I think, to the normal marketer as far as what this looks like in practice and how this can be added. So I just wanted to preface with like jumping right into testing is probably not the best idea if you don't have a solid foundation maybe for MTA and kind of what that path to purchase looks like before you kind of jump to the next level. But yeah, I think obviously Ron and Jim will have more insight here as far as doing this in practice.
Yeah, I'll take a bit of a stab. I mean, I think testing it's really valuable because it gives you for a period of time close to the best understanding of your marketing for a specific channel tactic as possible. There's a cost to doing it. There's like a literal cost in terms of you're not serving media into an area, or you're scaling up media if you're doing a scale-up test. Either one of those have a cost. One has a media cost, one has a revenue impact cost. There's an operational cost. All of a sudden you need someone in your team to go log into an ad platform and make adjustments, or you're a third-party vendor. You have to now coordinate with them to go log into the platform and make the adjustments for you. There's an there's an orchestration cost. You're running this test and you need to make sure nobody else in your entire company does things to ruin that test, which is easier said than done. And there's a time cost as well. Like this, you don't kick off a test and have your answer tomorrow. It could take a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, ranges based on everything you're saying. So it's sort of like it's an extremely, extremely powerful tool, but you want to make sure you use it at the right times. And for me, the way that I think about it is you want to have a real clear thesis, or I don't know why I'm doing thumbs up. You want to have a clear thesis or hypothesis if you want to test and be thoughtful about running that test. But to get to that thesis or hypothesis, to Matt's point, you kind of need either, I think you need your data foundation, you need your core MTA, maybe you run a media mix model. Maybe through all this, you start to get a question, hey, I really need to understand if I could scale more into meta, or I really feel like my direct mail just feels off. Like you'll start to get these intuitions. And to me, that is or discrepancies between different numbers. That's to me what kicks off, hey, let's run a test. It's worth it to spend the time, energy, money, and cost for this test because the potential impact to our marketing is so big. All that being said, I have heard some brands who just kind of say, no matter what, I'm going to have to run a branded SEM test at some point. It's kind of true, to be frank. So I think if at any point you want to run a brand SEM test, it's not the worst thing in the world to do. All that being said, you run your test, now what? First way is you can incorporate into your media mix model. The way that we think about it is more refined or narrow priors for your next model build. If you have a better sense of what the actual incrementality, or rather the potential ROAS or CPA, whatever KPI is for given channels from that test, you want to use that as an input to your media mix model. Also, you can use it to calibrate or apply multipliers on top of your core attribution data. So again, you run the incrementality test, you find out that direct mail is only 80% incremental, you're going to want to downweight likely the value that your core attribution that you use every single day is showcasing for direct mail. And that's kind of the order of operations that I kind of think this whole thing's, how they all play together.
Yeah, I think I've seen it play out a couple of different ways. I think on one side, you have companies that are maybe a little bit smaller. They're not quite to the point where they want to go all in on MMM yet, but they still have questions and there's still some uncertainty into how certain campaigns are performing or how certain creatives are performing. And for that, they want to maybe just do a quick test. And for that, there are things like, in-platform conversion lift studies in Meta, for example, or Google, that are a little bit easier to get up and running. It requires less sort of coordination, like Ron was saying. And that's great. Like, that's a good way to kind of start to build that muscle and see, like, okay, there's some uncertainty here. Let's reduce that through a test. Yes, there's still some cost involved in it, but we think there's gains to be made there. The other way I see it happening, and I see this pretty commonly with companies that are just kind of starting off with MMM, is they know their last click. They've been using last click and they know it's wrong. They want to do MMM, and then they get the MMM, and it's not uncommon for kind of the first iteration of an MMM to still have some uncertainty in it, right? Depending on how your spend has varied across channels, across time, and how much spend you're spending in certain channels, there's still going to be some uncertainty in the model. It might have some channels that it's like, it knows pretty sure what the ROI of this channel is, but this other channel that you spend a little bit less in, and maybe it hasn't been live as long, there's a larger confidence interval with how performant that it thinks that model is. And so the obvious next question is, well, we know last click is wrong. The model thinks the ROI is somewhere between 1.2 and 3.3. Let's go ahead and test that and get a little bit more certain there, because that could be the difference between shutting the channel off or holding the spend level or increasing our spend there. And so that's valuable. I could share a good example at the end. I think we have an option for some examples of that. But yeah, I think those are kind of the two ways that I've seen testing being pulled into the mix.
Awesome. And that kind of leads us into the next question, which is kind of like which do you choose when? And you all have kind of spoken to this at a high level, but I think we'll just directly answer it. There are so many measurement tools available. How should brands be thinking about this or deciding when to use MTA versus MMM versus testing? Are there specific campaign types or marketing objectives that lend themselves better to one solution over another?
Yeah, I mean, we have covered parts of this, but like in an ideal world, you do all three. But obviously that's not always possible because these things aren't free, and there's a budget decision that needs to be made. How much do you spend on these things? And given most marketers are already resource constrained, they'd rather put that money towards the actual media than measuring the media, usually. So yeah, it usually comes down to budget constraints and deciding again where you're at. Is your spend level, does it make sense to go into MMM or not? How many channels you have, and so forth. The other part of that question was like, there are certain channels that testing just doesn't work on, right? Like, I mean, you could probably, if you really try hard, construct a test, but like affiliate marketing, influencers, podcasts to a certain extent, these are all channels that can be really hard to run a geolift experiment on. And so some channels just don't allow themselves to be tested very easily. So that's going to be a consideration as well.
Yeah, I think that to Jim's point here, it's like the catalyst that gets a marketer to start thinking about these things is the diversification of channels and how you measure those. So as far as how do you decide, I feel like it's somewhat dictated by your channel mix, where you might not be as eager to jump in or to spend that. To the point he just made, if you're only spending on Meta, you might not be questioning essentially the incremental output of Meta. But if you're starting to spend on, let's say, TV, where maybe you are in a little bit of the dark and you're like, we can't measure this with MTA. How are we going to kind of solve this problem? That's where you start to introduce these things. So that's at least what we see when we onboard customers all the time who like just start advertising, let's say on audio and podcast, and are like, we're starting to make this huge 100K investment a month. We need the tools here to help measure the output of this. So that's typically the catalyst. And to the point before, these things cost, they're almost like step function in costs, and that's also a driving factor of like, okay, am I okay foregoing this media spend to get this measurement output?
Yeah, I kind of think the way I view it is you start from the bottom and work your way up, kind of using that Jim's layering word. I like that again. I think to start, you need something to use every day. Like you need something that you can log into and understand how are things kind of going. They might be direct, somewhat right, somewhat wrong. I'm not trying to pretend it can be perfect, but if you're just on Meta and Google, frankly, I think you could just use Meta's own platform numbers, Google's own platform numbers, and GA for a pretty long time, and avoid the mess of this entire conversation in some capacity. I think later on, I will also shout out for post surveys. I think is a really great initial way to, not even initial way, at some point, I think it's very valuable and worthwhile to include. Just hearing directly from your customers can be super powerful there. To me, the next step is actually thinking more about deduplicated cross-channel day-to-day data. And that's really the question of, does Google Analytics still do it for me? And I actually just posted about this like last week, but we see across our clients, like roughly a third of their revenue, marketing events, and conversions aren't trackable in Google Analytics. And that's because they're investing in offline channels like linear TV, direct mail, CTV, heavily into upper funnel channels like the more branding parts of the TikTok or Snapchat or Pinterest. So at some point, you're going to realize a large portion of marketing isn't getting into my daily source of attribution. I need something else. So that's when you probably want to invest, in my mind, in your first, more robust attribution product. Rockerbox.
Like Rockerbox.
Thank you. I try not to just put them in all that. And then you start to layer on top of that. You layer on top media mix modeling when it makes sense, when you have 2 years worth of data, when you have enough of a channel mix to make it worthwhile, when you have these business, not exogenous business factors that actually could have a big impact on your marketing. You layer on linear TV when you have that first experiment you want to run, that first thing that you don't understand. But I would go back to, I think, what Jim was saying in terms of change management. Like, you need to crawl, walk, run this. If you start at the end, you can't start at the finish line. You can't be reporting on last click GA and then come and suddenly report exclusively on incrementality tests that you ran a month ago, a quarter ago, 6 months ago. Like, everyone will freak out. So just take your time, work your way through it, but eventually you'll get all the way up the pyramid.
So there are a couple of questions in the chat that actually lend themselves really well to the next question that we wanted to talk about, which is around challenges that marketers face when they're trying to combine methodologies. So David asked, Ron, given your earlier example of using testing results to modify MTA data, do you mean providing 2 sets of reporting for marketing performance or a singular view? If it's the latter, how do you recommend keeping such progress consistent and reliable in the long run?
I do think that the right, I mean, I think if we were all sitting back and like dreaming a marketing solution out of the, let's just like pretend we're starting from ground zero. I think we'd want to probably have one final number that is just like the God number, the perfect number that answers everything. That's like the goal to get to. I think what we've been talking a lot about over the course of this webinar is that there are various inputs that lead to that God number, that perfect number. And I think that that's what one should aspire towards over time. I'm not going to say if any company is there or not there, or how good anyone is, but like I think about it as like this unified KPI across all the different measurement methodologies. The difficult part is you're not going to be able to have all of the KPIs from all the other measurement solutions at all times. Great example is you're never going to be able to get the CPA from the media mix model for ad number 1, 2, 3 in Meta. It's not going to get that granular. So like when you are trying to do that unified KPI, you're going to have some gaps. To Jim's point, like if you're trying to do unified KPI on podcast, you're not going to really be able to run a test for podcasts. So I think you need to accept that there will be some gaps. You won't be able to have consistent KPIs for MTA, MMM testing, and surveys across the board. You just won't. But I think you need to work with the constraints that you have. I do think it's a really good point, though, that it's hard to do this. I'm not trying to pretend that it's easy to have a really consistent media mix modeling schedule, testing schedule, all of that. And that's kind of where I view everything from the perspective of doing the least you can to get the most that you need. Like, what are the least number of tests that you can run that give you the answers you need? What are the least number of media mix models that you can build And that can literally be a number of models. Like some companies say, I need 20 different models. I'm like, do you really need 20 models? Or could you have one model? Like, what's the least you could do to get what you need? But it is, frankly, we have not yet made it easy enough for marketers to operationalize this framework of having all different methodologies running at all different times. I think we can get there or get closer to there, but there's a lot of work to be done before we're there.
Yeah, and the buzzword that's been going around for the past year or so is triangulation. Everyone, we need to triangulate the numbers. And
I'm done with that word, by the way.
I still kind of like it. I don't know. It's whatever. Marketers have to ruin things by naming them. But for the longest time, I was so frustrated because I kept seeing everyone saying, "Oh, triangulation," but no one was putting out there like, "Here's how you do it. Step 1, step 2, step 3," and this is where so. I hate to say this, but Google actually put out a great piece of content on this earlier this year. And I'm not a Google fanboy. I'm usually the opposite. I usually am very cynical and skeptical of any content that they put out, usually because it's self-serving rubbish. But in this one case, and maybe a couple others, they actually had some really good content on it. It was it's called the Modern Measurement Playbook, and it actually lays out specific examples. Here's how you can take your MTA, your MMM, and your testing, and incorporate all these signals with specific examples and like spreadsheet of, this signal says this and this signal says this, and here's how you can combine them, and here you could create a multiplier so that when you're in Facebook ads and it says a ROAS of 1.2, you apply this multiplier. So now day to day, you can still log in and see, well, it says 1.2, I apply this multiplier, it's probably really still this. And if Meta is reporting it's going up, then you consistently, you just have that multiplier. So I think that's one thing that, to that question, like do we report two different numbers or not? I think the God number that Ron mentioned is something that we should all kind of put at the top of the mountain and try to get up there to get to that point. But it is hard. It's not easy. There's no platforms or tools that I'm aware of that sort of make this easy and just say, like, give us all your data and we'll do this for you. It's still kind of a manual, get into the spreadsheets and work it out yourself.
All right, you've made it so I cannot say this. One, I actually agree with you. Google did a great job with putting out that report. I disagree with a lot of it, to be honest with you, and I'm happy to talk about why. But I think I give them a ton of credit, and I've actually spoken to them, and I think that they did a great service to the industry, and at least putting a stake in the ground of how they think measurement should be done. I think part of the problem with their approach, frankly, is that they view each type of measurement almost as if not of equal value, but of equal purpose. And I think that really it doesn't take the crawl, walk, run approach as well, in the sense of they're kind of saying you can kind of start with you can start with testing, or you can start with medium and small. But my whole issue with these is always, what do you do every single day? Like, I feel like unless you have your daily piece of information that your marketing team is going to look at, you're going to struggle to apply or leverage MMM or testing in your organization. And that's actually where I think your layering approach makes more sense. Like, you need to start somewhere and then keep layering on things that make it more effective. It's a leading indicator. We're going to be talking a little bit more about this in weeks to come. So stay tuned. I think I've become that platform, but I do give Google similarly a ton of credit. I think they did a big service to the industry for getting that first paper out there.
Yeah, it wasn't self-serving at all from what I read through it. Like, it wasn't saying you should spend more on Google Ads.
I agree with you, but they are pushing for it. This will lead to some more spend on YouTube, but I think YouTube is I think it's underspent into anyway, so I'm okay with it.
Yeah. The last thing to chime in here as far as combining methodologies is just to kind of harp on again, you don't need one methodology that works across every channel. So when you're thinking about combining methodologies, like your methodology for TV might be very different than your methodology for Meta from like a day-to-day operational perspective. So that's just one thing to note. Like, there is a kind of single number you could point to, but that number might be a derivative of a different calculation on a per channel basis. And that's something definitely to keep kind of in the toolkit and think about as you try to combine or attempt to triangulate, as we said.
So you're not for monotheism in terms of gods, but polytheism. That's their approach?
Correct.
Sorry, going into my God thing.
We only have 5 minutes left. Instead of going through the last couple of questions here, I do think there's a couple questions in the chat about reconciling discrepancies when you're trying to use multiple methodologies, which is something I know on the Rockerbox side, we have helped a number of customers through as we've launched MMM and testing alongside our attribution platform. Ron, do you want to kind of speak to how we're leading some of our customers through these challenges? They're not abnormal. So
Yeah, I mean, I'll actually throw it to Matt. Apologies. I know Matt, like you've dealt with this direct. We were talking about this post-purchase surveys and how you can leverage the data there compared to like last click. And I think you brought up, at least when we talked like weeks ago. So hopefully you still remember some cool examples of like those discrepancies and how you've helped customers use that to reconcile the data.
Yeah, in Fairing, in our platform, you can compare last click data compared to survey response data. And this is kind of what I was alluding to before, is like, how do you start to convince internal teams to think less about last click? And this view is a very easy way to showcase that. This is what kind of my general understanding of what is driving revenue is today. And now this is what it looks like when I actually loop in customer data. And that variance is quite large, especially when you like certain channels. And like, for example, TikTok, I see here, like TikTok, the variance is quite large compared to that of Meta from a click data. So it's really dependent on channel. Obviously podcasts and less click-based channels, it's going to be even more apparent. But to us, that's kind of step one as far as being able to compare again, MTA versus survey when it comes to that. I think a question I wanted to throw to Ron too is, if we think about click-based measurement, the one value that from a bottoms-up approach and looking at clicks is you do get more granular level click data at the session level. And I'm curious, like when I was on the merchant side now, which is a few years ago, like looking at channel level click data and looking at bounce rates and kind of call it micro conversions were part of my daily practice. Which is essentially an early input into an MTA if we're thinking about those path to purchase and those interactions. How do you guys think about that at all as far as engagement on site on, let's say, add to cart? Because some of this stuff, I'll like open someone's GA and it'll be like, hey, this traffic from Meta has an 80% bounce rate. Like for this math to work out, like you don't even need an MMM or an MTA. Like you're telling me that like 1 out of 5 people need to purchase or need to actually go to the next page and purchase. The odds of that are quite low. So it's kind of like a pre-method measurement tool.
So this leads actually, I think we've talked a lot about measurement, but to me, it all actually is built on top of the data foundation. If you don't have the underlying data sets, none of this stuff matters. And to me, one of the key data sets is path to conversion. Conversion could be bottom funnel purchase. It could be mid funnel add to cart. It could be upper funnel email capture. It could be not a conversion, but a session of a web visit as well. I think those are core data sets that every marketer needs in their data warehouse, to be frank, before they almost do anything. You kind of helped us out here. We're actually launching a data set on this in a couple of weeks. He didn't know this too, so that's just cool.
I did not know that.
There you go. But it's actually exactly to that. It's like, how do we take the same marketing taxonomies and schemas that you use for your conversions and apply that for session generation? And starting to ask questions like, which channels are driving sessions for new customers? And what is the on-site conversion rate of those customers versus others? What's the bounce rate of those versus others? I think you're completely right. And this is often where we get so focused on like these super sophisticated measurement methodologies, when sometimes if you just have the underlying data and you just like look at stuff, things feel off. And you can quickly sense, I should not be investing in this channel that everyone's bouncing off of. So yeah, thanks for the plug.
Awesome. Well, we only have a minute left, so I think this is a good kind of pausing point. I know that there are a number of questions in the chat that we did not get to today. We will do our best to go through all of those and address them in a resource that we send after this with the recording. In case anyone was wondering, yes, this is recorded. Yes, it will be sent to you. I've really appreciated this conversation. Thank you all for joining on the panel. I think that we probably could have done 4 sessions on this topic and still had a number of questions that we didn't get to. So I really appreciate your candor and your conversation with each other. And thank you to the audience for joining and being so engaging. I think we had more questions on the first couple of questions that the panel spoke to than we get in some webinars altogether. So definitely a topic we'll continue to talk about. And we look forward to following up with you all soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
everybody.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Matt. My office station.